In this lecture, we are going to do a survey of the weapons of the People's Liberation Army and the People's Liberation Army Ground Forces, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, and the People's Liberation Army Navy. The reason we're picking China is simply because it's a peer competitor of the US, and being a very large military, it has the full array of different kinds of weapon systems. It's important to know how to identify weapon systems. The professional military leader uses combinations of weapons in their organization in order to achieve their mission. And these weapons are important on their own, and they're also important in how they're integrated together. You must know, however, that while weapons are important, they're not the most important factor. And the tactics, the operations, the strategy, the organization, the leadership, the inventiveness, the motivation of the soldiers interacting with the complexities of the electromagnetic spectrum, the weather, and the geography all impact the performance of these systems. And so we need to understand weapons within the social context of how soldiers use the weapons. It is counterintuitive, but the quality of the soldier is almost always more important than the technology of the weapon. A poorly trained soldier with a very high-tech weapon is going to be defeated by an older piece of technology with a more motivated and well-organized soldier. Although not strictly a weapon, organizations in countries are the ways that weapons are deployed. In China, we have armies that are indicated here by the 3 X's, and they're deployed in military regions, which you can see here, which typically consists of a number of army bases. The PLAAF is the People's Liberation Army Air Force. Again, not specifically a weapon, but you can see that the military regions in China have different air headquarters, which help group different kinds of aircraft that have different kinds of missions, or aircraft in different parts of China. Here you can see some of the 150 air bases within China where aircraft are deployed. The Chinese fleet, the plan, People's Liberation Army Navy, is deployed at 3 ports, Chengdu, Dehai, and Zhenjiang, along with Hainan Island. And these deploy the North, East, and South fleets. And so this is a way of organizing ships and submarines logistically as well as operationally. You can see here the number of soldiers in the People's Liberation Army, approximately 2 million in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the 2nd Artillery Force, which comprises the nuclear weapons. The weapons themselves are nothing without the personnel to operate them. The Chinese military personnel are deployed in the Army, 1.6 million, of which 800,000 are 2-year conscripts. The Navy has 255,000, of which 40,000 are conscripts. Most of the Navy is professional because of the high demands of technical competence. The Air Force is 330,000. They're entirely volunteers. The Strategic Missile Force is 100,000 personnel. And you can see here in the bottom right a section, which is the smallest unit in most militaries. It's between 8 and 12 soldiers, typically broken up into 2 or 3 groups, each with a machine gun and assault rifles. And it's headed by a section commander or a squad commander, and there's different terminologies in different militaries. An important aspect of training are training assets. And here you can see soldiers using a simulation first-person shooter to learn how to cooperate together on the battlefield. Militaries have hierarchies that enable them to pass orders down efficiently and to collect information. And this organization is typically based on experience or aptitude, and typically you have officers who do the commanding, and working for them are the non-commissioned members. And very often you have an NCO corps, non-commissioned officers, who basically deal with the leadership and the training. It isn't correct to think of one rank as better than another. It would be more appropriate to look at soldiers' specializations. In general, the lower rank soldiers do most of the technical work with the small arms. And as you move up in rank, soldiers are trained in more staff work, which involves planning and logistics and communications and medical evacuation. So it's a good base for every soldier to start at the bottom and to learn how to use the small arms. But when you get to the higher levels, the higher ranked officers don't even carry firearms because it's rare for them to have an opportunity to use it, and they're deployed very far from the actual battlefield. So a rank structure, and here you can see the Chinese rank structure, distinguishes the different levels and the different, in this case, the different environments in which the soldiers would operate. Clothing is a very important part of a soldier's equipment, especially when they're deployed in difficult environments like very cold environments or very hot environments like arid deserts or jungles. The standard rifle from the 1950s on in the People's Liberation Army is the Type 56 SKS rifle, which is a copy of the Soviet Simonov semi-automatic rifle. It's got a small capacity magazine and it fires a standard Warsaw Pact round, and today it's used by the Chinese militia. It's no longer in frontline use. The PLA Type 56 is a copy of the Soviet AK-47 assault rifle, and it's also in reserve use currently. In other words, it's not used by frontline troops, but it would be used if there was a large recruitment drive from the civilian population, and a lot of these weapons are in storage, ready for that purpose. This is the Type 81 assault rifle, which was a Chinese elaboration of the AK-47 and is also in reserve use. This is the Type 81, which is a copy of the Soviet RPD-44 light machine gun. So you'd have two of these for every section of 10 men. So one person would be operating this to provide suppression fire on an enemy, while other soldiers maneuver with lighter rifles and hand grenades to destroy the target. This is the Type 67 general purpose machine gun, which has since been replaced in Chinese service. This would typically be deployed one per platoon of around 30 soldiers. It's very heavy, and so it's not very mobile, but it provides sustained fire because it's got a mechanism that allows it to cool the barrel, and it fires a heavier bullet, so it can put a lot of fire onto a target to suppress it. This is a copy of the Russian DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun. This is particularly heavy, Second World War vintage. It can be used against light vehicles, but as you can see, it requires a crew to pull it. So these are the new standard small arms in the People's Liberation Army since 2003. This is the QBZ-95 assault rifle, a bullpup design standard in the Chinese military. This is the QCW-05 5.8mm submachine gun used by elite units. A submachine gun does not have very long range, so you're shooting at less than 100 meters, less than the distance of a soccer or a football field, but it does allow for a higher rate of fire. The rounds tend to be smaller, which means they don't have as much penetrating power, so they are not going to penetrate an obstacle if someone's hiding behind it. But if you have elite soldiers that need to move very quickly in closed-in environments like urban territory, this is an ideal weapon. This is the QBB-95 light machine gun, of which there are 2 deployed for every section of 10 soldiers. This is a QJY-88 light machine gun, which replaced the general purpose machine gun indicated before. This is a Type 80 general purpose machine gun, which is a copy of the Russian PKMS. And you'd have one of these deployed, typically one per platoon, but very often one per section. It varies. This is the W85 12.7mm heavy machine gun, useful against light vehicles, against soldiers, enemy soldiers inside built-up areas like a building, or against helicopters. This is the Type 88 5.8mm QBZ-95 sniper rifle. Because it's not bolt action, it's got a complicated mechanism that allows it to fire semi-automatically. The bullet, when it leaves the barrel, causes the firearm to deviate because of the movement of the mechanism inside. So it's not really a sniper rifle. It's more of a medium-range precision rifle, and you'd have typically one of these deployed for every section of 10 soldiers. This is the QBJ-10 12.7mm sniper rifle. These were originally designed in the First and Second World Wars as anti-vehicle weapons, so you can fire them at trucks and disable them. They can also be used against human targets, and their advantage is a very large bullet with a lot of powder and therefore great distance. And this weapon is rather slow, and its distribution varies per units. This is a Type 87 QJ 35mm automatic grenade launcher. Grenades can be lethal if you can land them against the target clearly, but most often grenades are fired against targets that are concealed, and so most of the explosive power is dissipated against obstacles. But it's useful for suppressing the enemy, so you're able to advance on them and get close enough to shoot them with other means. This is the LG 340mm grenade launcher, which is a copy of the US Mark 19 grenade launcher, which is itself a copy of the Russian AGS-17 grenade launcher. These systems are quite efficient. I saw one operated at Fort Drum, a high rate of fire, but it goes through the ammunition very, very quickly, and it's not very mobile. Typically, you'll have these mounted on a vehicle. This is the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade. You can see the pineapple at the front, which is actually a hollow, because you've got a parabolic shape, which has a feature where when it's detonated, you get a shock wave that turns the air into plasma, and the quality of plasma is such that it strips the electrons away from atoms, and so it takes atoms apart. So if you were to fire this at a metal object, it would essentially take the electrons away and then drill a hole through the metal armor and then throw molten metal on the inside. The tip of it is a piezoelectric quartz, which when it's broken sets off a electrical charge, which detonates the shape charge. So this is essentially an anti-tank weapon and an anti-building weapon. This is a Type 56 75mm recoilless rifle, which were first used during the Second World War and extensively in Korea. The Chinese have about 4,000 in use. The advantage of these is they can be fired by infantry on a bipod, and because most of the backblast from the projectile is emitted through the back and not kept within the tube, the recoil is significantly reduced, and so it doesn't jump away. So infantry can operate this. That's why we call it a recoilless rifle. This is a PF 120mm anti-tank rocket launcher, of which some are in use. And so a rocket will be fired out of here. The back end, of course, is not closed, and so the back blast, you'd have the propellant shooting out the back, and so it's very important not to have people standing behind the rocket when it's fired. These are typically used to destroy tanks. So you've got a shape charge because these rockets are not fast, but they deliver the ordnance to an enemy armored target, and then you have a shape charge which goes off and burrows its way through the armor. Using plasma, as I described earlier. This is the HJ-8 anti-tank guided missile, which looks very much like a Milan or a TOW launcher in NATO and US use. These are very heavy, takes multiple crews, and the rockets here tend to be wire guided and quite sophisticated. In other words, it trails a little wire as the rocket advances. when these are detected at long range, a puff of smoke will appear, and the rockets here are not fast. Typically, the target tank will have a few moments to try to get behind an undulation in the ground to hide, and its machine guns will be fired in this general direction to try to suppress those who are using the optical sights to guide the rocket in on the tank target. This is the HN-5B MANPAD, or Man Portable Air Defense. It doesn't fire very far, just 1 or 2 kilometers, but it's very useful to deal with low-flying aircraft, which do occasionally occur. Not all aircraft are firing laser-guided weapons at several kilometers, especially if you're dealing with complicated terrain. It's also useful against helicopters. This is the FN-6 MANPAD, Man Portable Air Defense. One of the issues with these is to correctly identify the target and not shoot down your own aircraft. So they're sparingly distributed among soldiers. So these are the weapons that would be distributed in a squad, that's the American term. The Canadian term would be a section of Class A Chinese infanteers or Marines. And you can see if you look at the top panel, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 soldiers. And going from the top left, you've got a soldier with their assault rifle, QBZ-95. They've got lighter anti-tank weapons that they carry on their shoulder that look like they're disposable. And then when you look at the bottom row, you've got a heavier anti-tank weapon and 2 other anti-tank weapons going from left to right. And everyone's got the same assault rifle. If you look at and you've got in the center of the top group 1 bipoded heavier section weapon. If you look at the lower group, there are 2 section weapons. So you have a lot of different ways to organize a squad of soldiers, but typically you have 1 section commander, who in the Canadian military would be a master corporal, in the US would be a sergeant, and you've got that section or squad broken up into 2 fire teams, and each fire team will typically consist of 1 machine gunner, who's not very mobile, and they're supported by 3 to 4 to 5 rifled soldiers who will maneuver with their firearms and grenades to close in on a target while the machine gunner suppresses the target. So China has about 1,300 of these Type 86 100mm anti-tank guns. They're not particularly useful because rockets are a lot more compact. These systems require trucks to drive them around. But China's got a lot of them left over from the Cold War period. Western countries have universally abandoned anti-tank weapons because the crews don't have a lot of protection, and it's not an efficient way of destroying a tank. It relies on a very high velocity anti-tank round, which today is reasonably easily defeated by the type of modern laminated armor. Here you can see an anti-tank crew operating the system. So they're going to have to drive into the location, drop the system off, and operate. The advantage of these weapons is that they're quite easy to conceal, much easier to hide than the tank or the armored vehicle they're trying to destroy. This is the WZ-501's copy of the Soviet BMP, which is basically a battlefield armored vehicle for infantry. So it's got a little turret on top, and some of them have anti-tank missiles, but it's primarily meant to carry between 6 and 8 soldiers who come out of the back door. So this is able to deploy them when they get to a target safely without having the soldiers march across the open field. It also allows the infantry to keep up with the tanks. Tanks are very expensive, but they don't see well, and they need infantry to be able to navigate through built-up difficult terrain like villages or forests. And so this is the vehicle that brings the infantry to the tank. The Chinese have about 700 of these. This is the Type 89 armored personnel carrier, of which China's got about 350. It's an indigenous Chinese version. This is the Type 63 armored personnel carrier, of which China's got about 1,650. This is a 1970s and 80s design. Some of these were used by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s and 1990s. So there's an export version of this. This is the Type 92B armored personnel carrier, also an APC. It looks like an armored car, but it also carries soldiers on the inside. China's got about 500 of these. There are environments where you've got reasonable enough roads that you can move a lot more quickly on wheeled vehicles, or where the off-road terrain is so difficult, like in the Himalayas, Even a tracked vehicle won't help you, and so these vehicles are perfectly fine for those types of environments. This is a Type 92 armored infantry fighting vehicle. An APC is basically a vehicle that carries soldiers. An armored infantry fighting vehicle is a vehicle that carries soldiers, and it has significant armaments that allows it to deal with enemy light targets. And typically it consists of a light machine gun, a heavy machine gun, a light cannon, or anti-tank rockets. This is a Type 09 armored personnel carrier, of which there are around 100 total. It's basically a copy of the LAV series in the West from the 1980s. This is the ZBD-03 armored infantry fighting vehicle, airborne. So it's an armored infantry fighting vehicle. China's got about 130 of these. So these would be dropped out of the back of an airplane. They would land by parachute. It's a pretty rough landing. And then the soldiers who are landing independently would then run up, unpack it, jump inside, and go drive off with one tank of gasoline, which will take them about 300 or 400 kilometers. This is the ZBD-04 armored infantry fighting vehicle, airborne, of which China's got about 500. So in theory, these would be dropped over into Taiwan across the straits by aircraft, and the soldiers would then rejoin them. You can see this vehicle is also amphibious, so it could cross rivers. This is the ZBD-05 armored infantry fighting vehicle, marine. So this is the vehicle that would come off of ships and would then move onto the beaches and onto the shores of Taiwan or against an island target. China's got about 250 of these. Here you can see the ZBD-05 armored amphibious assault vehicle, which is a version of the armored infantry fighting vehicle operating onto a shore. Here you can see a WZ-523 armored personnel carrier, wheeled. This is a unique Chinese design, of which there are around 100. And you can see it's very useful in the Himalayan terrain. It allows you to move across the available roads quite quickly. This is a PLA Far Truck. There are a great many trucks and logistical vehicles and transport vehicles in the Chinese military, a variety of them. So I'm not going to show you every type of truck, but just know that there are light, medium. This is the HJ-9 anti-tank guided missile, of which China's got anti-tank guided missile carrier. The vehicle looks like a copy of a Soviet BRDM, and this particular variant of the vehicle has an anti-tank rocket system on the top. And you can see 4 tubes, and it's probably got some extra tubes to fire at tanks. And these things can typically fire up to 4,000 meters. This is the PTL-02 100mm self-propelled anti-tank weapon. The problem with wheeled vehicles and big guns is that when the gun fires, the recoil actually changes the trajectory of the round leaving the barrel. Because typically the projectile leaves at less than a kilometer a second, and that's enough time for the barrel to deviate the round's direction. So it's not a very stable platform, but you do have mobility. And if you're using the cannon to fire at a relatively short range against a building, for example, you're not trying to destroy armor, you're just trying to knock the building over with high explosives, it can be useful. So China's got 350 of these. This is the Type 89 120mm self-propelled anti-tank gun. So this thing looks like artillery, but that's a tank gun, which means it's intended to destroy other armored vehicles. Typically the issue with anti-tank guns like this, self-propelled, meaning it's a tank chassis, is that they're not well armored. So it's supposed to deploy to an area, hide behind obstacles, and then snipe at enemy armored vehicles. So it's not really useful unless it can get to a location first. This is the Type 62 85mm gun light tank, of which China's got 400, and these are useful in closed-in areas like China's border with Vietnam. China invaded Vietnam in 1979, or patrols in the Himalayas opposite their border with India, or in the mountainous area north of Beijing when China had their border war with the Soviet Union in 1969. In theory, it would be useful for the narrow valleys in Korea if ever China had to fight the US and the South Koreans again. This is the Type 63 85mm light tank, of which there are 200 total. And you can see the chassis is an armored personnel carrier with an upgun turret and some amphibious modifications. This is important for crossing rivers, which is what you want to do if you want to keep the momentum and advance going. This is the Type 59 100mm gun main battle tank, of which there were 4,300. That's a lot. This is actually a very light tank. It's much smaller than the picture gives an impression of, and most of these are now in storage because they've been used for 40-50 years, so there's not a lot of spare parts, and most of the engines are run down, so they're no longer in frontline use. Here you can see a mass tank assault without infantry support. This is not recommended. These tanks won't be able to see an anti-tank crew or an incoming missile round from a built-up area. So, but this is, we think of this sort of a crazy cavalry charge with a bunch of tanks charging. The tanks will do well if they can see their enemy target, but normally they would need support from helicopters and infantry to be able to point out targets. Here's a Type 79 105mm gun main battle tank, the T-59 variant. So it's the tank that I showed you earlier, and they modified it. So they put a modern gunnery system, targeting system, overpressure, nuclear, biological, chemical system. There are about 300 of these. Again, this looks like a completely new tank, but it's actually just the Type 59 variant with a new gun. This is a 125mm standard Soviet and Russian anti-tank gun. And there are other modifications to do with optics and overpressure and the engine. But essentially, it's an old hull. So rather than building a new tank, they took old tanks and refitted them. It was basically cheaper, much cheaper to do it that way. It's got a crew of 4, and it's got an all-welded hull, which frankly is not revolutionary. It's sort of 1950s tech for the West, but a welded hull is much stronger than a hull held together with rivets. This is a Type 96, of which China's got 2,500, and they're producing about 300 per year. Again, this is not a new tank. It's a Type 59, a 1950s design, with an upgraded internal system to do with optics, the engine, the 125mm gun. Now, its main advantage is its composite armor. Again, in the West, it's 1970s technology, but it's armor made with metal, with empty spacing on the inside, and with super strong porcelain, basically the stuff that people make sinks and toilets out of. But in a special combination and layered, it's more than twice as strong as just flat steel. You have an improved turret design. It's got thermal optics, which is, again, Western technology from the 1980s, so it can see in the dark and distinguish against colder and harder targets. It's also got optical jammers from the 1990s, and this allows it to interfere with anti-tank rockets that are using a laser designator to hit the tank. This is the Type 99, and this is actually a completely new tank. It looks very similar to Soviet and Russian designs, the T-64 and the T-72. It's got your 125mm anti-tank gun. China's got about 500 of these. The specific advantage of the Type 99, which is also available for export as the main battle tank 2000, is that it's got a commander's position that's improved and allows the commander to use electronic interface to select targets for the gunner. This here is the driver's position of the Type 99 tank. Here's the gunner's position, including the optics. Here you can see the different rounds, 125mm, 100mm, 105mm for the 3 different gun types used in the People's Liberation Army. They're all of the same general type, APF-SDS, which is armor piercing, fin stabilized, discarding sabot. So what you have is a uranium or a tungsten core, which is just the arrow. And when you fire this thing, the sabot, which is the outer casing, falls off. the arrow, and it imparts the momentum to the arrow. And this arrow hits the tank at an incredible high speed. And because it's made of tungsten or depleted uranium, it basically uses kinetic energy to knock its way through. And it splinters the metal on the inside. This is an alternative to the plasma charge I described earlier, which is a very slow-moving round. But when it gets to the armor, it creates plasma by taking the electrons away from atoms and basically pulverizing whatever matter it comes across. This is the autoloader in a Type 99, which is a copy of the Soviet and the Russian system, where the Russians have only a 3-man or woman crew, and they have this device which loads the rounds. Western countries have found that they can achieve a higher rate of fire, almost twice, by having a human loader, and a human loader to select the different kinds of munitions. And in tank warfare, the first round has an enormous impact on the outcome of the battle. And so Western countries have put a lot of their emphasis on getting the first round out, where the Chinese and the Russians don't. They have a different approach, which is basically saturation with large numbers of tanks. This is the Type 83 122mm artillery gun, of which China's got 3,800. Again, these types of systems that are not self-propelled are fairly unusual in the West because they're vulnerable. When you fire a round, the enemy radar will detect the trajectory of that round and will then call in a retaliating artillery fire on this location. So immediately after these guys fire, they have to get out of there. Otherwise, incoming rounds will destroy them. And because they don't have any cover in the form of armor, they're very vulnerable. So this is not an efficient way of conducting an artillery attack. This is the Type 96 122mm, so it's the same gun size as the previous system. This is actually the copy of the Soviet D-30, of which the Chinese have about 3,800, included in the total for the Type 83. This is the Type 66 152mm gun, so it's a larger round. This is a copy of the Soviet D-20, of which there's 2,106. This is a Type 66 battery of artillery firing. This is the Type 59 130mm gun, the famous Soviet M46, one of the most efficient types of artillery. The Chinese have 234 of these. The Soviet artillery was well designed from an engineering point of view. The issue, again, is one of protection. These artillery batteries are very vulnerable to a counter battery fire. That's where other artillery is bringing rounds in to destroy these rounds, these artillery pieces. Here you can see a Soviet M46 being loaded onto a truck, and again, this truck is unarmored, so you'd have to fire off a couple of rounds, load it up to the truck, and drive out as quickly as possible to a new location where you unlimber the artillery piece, and then you get information on your next target and you keep firing. And the big issue here is resupply. These cannons fire an awful lot of rounds, and so you need a long collection of trucks constantly resupplying them. Artillery kills 50% of the enemy on most modern battlefields, so this arm is far more important than, say, rifles or machine guns or even tanks. Here you can see a Type 83 152mm howitzer. China's got some of these. Now, a howitzer is different from a gun because it's designed to fire a weaker propellant on a round, so the round has a high trajectory. In other words, it creates an arch. So you can use this to fire over a mountain and down the other side, which is how they're using it here. You can see the mountain in the background. Here's a Type 85 155mm. It looks like it's a copy of a Western design. This is definitely a copy of the Western design. It's a WAC 21 155mm, of which China's got about 150. These are useful. They're self-propelled, so you can drive this thing down the road just using the equipment that you have here, and it looks like it's quick deployment. So you can fire it, drive it down the road. And the reason you'd want this type of artillery round and not a self-propelled vehicle, meaning a tank with a giant artillery piece, is you can stick this in an airplane, fly it across country to an airfield, and then deploy it. So it's much more mobile strategically, because you can fly it around hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers to a new location. This is a Type 70-1 122 millimeter self-propelled howitzer, of which China's got about 1,300. Here you've got a very short-range gun, but because it's a howitzer, it can fire over targets, and because it's armored, it's much more likely to survive counter-battery fire and to continue to operate. Artillery has a difficult time destroying armored vehicles because the round has to land right on top of the vehicle to have an effect, which is rare. Most artillery is explosive and it throws metallic splinters around, and those metallic splinters won't penetrate this armor. This is a Type 89 122 millimeter self-propelled howitzer. The howitzer allows this vehicle to fire a round over obstacles in the immediate front. China's got about 300 of these, 1,300 of these. You can see again it's armored, which allows it to engage in safe counter-battery fire. So it can fire off its rounds and it doesn't have to immediately leave. Normally, this type of caliber is firing around about 12 to 15 kilometers, depending on whether the round is boosted. Some of the heavier versions of these self-propelled guns can fire rounds up to 25 kilometers. Again, the main issue is resupplying these units quickly enough to maintain their rate of fire. Here you can see the Type 83. This is a 152 millimeter cannon, of which China's got about 300. You typically have a forward air controller or an artillery observer located about 15 kilometers to the front with a radio, and they're directing fire, and it's a very difficult job. They have to be able to identify targets, which is very often difficult, not expose friendly forces to artillery fire. There are just endless stories of artillery accidentally being dropped on friendly forces. It's a hazard of war. It's unavoidable, and it's a part of the risk of using artillery. The artillery controllers at the front with the radio, they have to send the messages very, very quickly, very, very accurately, and it's difficult because they have to be able to identify using binoculars what they're looking at on the ground, interpret that onto a map, turn that into grid coordinates, which then are fed to the artillery. The artillery have to figure out the trigonometric physics of the rounds they're firing, what kind of trajectory they're going to have, and you have many different guns all firing at the same target, so each of these vehicles is going to have a slightly different degree designation of its target. So there's a lot of math involved, and very good artillery people manage to memorize the physics tables on all of that trigonometry. It's quite impressive. This is a PLZ-07 122 millimeter self-propelled gun, of which there's about 1,300. To me, this looks like a copy of a Paladin with a small gun, which is a version of a vehicle that Canada had at one point. This is the PLZ-05 Howitzer. So it's the same vehicle with a different cannon. And again, being a howitzer, it can fire over obstacles. There's 126 of this variety. This is the PLZ-45 ammunition vehicle. So this vehicle will back up, and it's got a very heavy crane because some of these rounds are very heavy. It'll back up to one of these cannons, and then it'll slide the rounds in through a hatch in the back. Here you can see the actual transferal of the munition from the ammunition vehicle to the howitzer. So this is a PL6 152 millimeter laser guided anti-tank shell. It's a copy of a Russian version of the US Copperhead from the 1980s. So this is fired by the artillery piece, but it's a rocket. So it'll be fired out, and then the fins will come on, and the front is an optical sight which will look for a laser. So you'll have a soldier with a laser gun somewhere near the front line, and they'll put a red dot on a target, and then this thing will look for the red dot and then come down it. Today there's a whole bunch of countermeasures against it, like sparklers, which basically it's a light show like a disco ball and puts lights everywhere, and this thing will get confused. But it's 1980s solution to using artillery to bring accurate weapons against advancing armor. This is a Type 63 multiple rocket launcher. These were developed during the Second World War. The British had Congreve rockets about 200 years earlier. Rockets are very inaccurate, but they can carry a high explosive warhead, and they can fire a lot of rockets at the same time. So a great deal of Russian and Chinese rocket launchers were distributed throughout the world. And here you can see one operating clearly outside of China. This is the Type 81 122 millimeter self-propelled multiple rocket launcher, of which China's got about 1,600. This is the PHZ 122 millimeter self-propelled multiple rocket launcher. You can see in the back just a long rack of these rockets. So it's going to fire off an awful lot of these rockets in a very small amount of time. This is the PHL-03 Type 03 300 millimeter self-propelled multiple rocket launcher, of which China's got about 96. This has got a 90-kilometer range, so that's a very long distance. So you use these things for saturation fire. You can put a lot of rounds on a target very quickly, much more quickly than artillery, but it's not going to be accurate. So you're not blasting a single target or a small group of targets. You're blasting an entire area and hoping to capture a number of different targets in that area. This is the P-12 short-range ballistic missile, which China's got a few. And this is basically a Chinese version of what the Russians deploy on the Chinese border. The Russians, not having the same confidence in their air power as the US or Western forces, has a large portion of its military firing conventional, chemical, and nuclear missiles from these types of trucks. And the Chinese are copying the Russians because they also don't have as much confidence in their air force being able to deliver heavy rounds on targets. This is the People's Liberation Army MLRS concept. It's basically a copy of an American system, multiple launch rocket system. Here you can see they have smaller rockets and not the big rockets that the Americans have. This is the Type 73 Armored Recovery Vehicle, very important. Most tanks that are disabled on the battlefield are not destroyed. They've lost an engine, they've lost a part of a turret, they've had some of their wheels removed. And if you had soldiers that could go out, recover the vehicles, bring them back to a repair station and fix them, then you would effectively get back more than half of the tanks that were destroyed in a given day. So this is a very, very important function. Obviously, you need to be able to go into the battlefield to recover your vehicles, and so it helps to be able to win and still hold it. This is a Type 59 Armored Vehicle Launch Bridge. These are very important. The Earth is not flat. In fact, 99% of the surface of the Earth will not accommodate armored vehicles. Armored vehicles get stuck in swamps. They sink in water. They can't go up mountains. If they drive over rocky terrain, the tread will fall off. If they drive on cemented roads for too long, their treads will suffer damage and de-link. So one of the most common obstacles is created by water. These are streams, gullies. Some of them have very steep sides. And so you need bridges to be able to move around. And this here is a tank which carries a fold-out bridge. And it can deploy the bridge within about a minute. So it could do it while a tank force is advancing. Here you can see a military pontoon bridge, very common. The Soviets invested the most in this type of construction because they wanted a way to travel quickly across Western Europe in the event of war, and China's copied the similar design. However, most Chinese heavy armored vehicles move by rail, and this is true in Europe as well. It's true in the US. It's true in Canada. It's just an efficient way of moving heavy equipment across great distances. So air defense. This is a Type 59 100mm air defense gun, of which China's got about 7,700. In the beginning, the logic was these would be used to shoot down enemy aircraft, but most modern American aircraft would operate outside the range of these guns. And so these guns are primarily useful for shooting down helicopters or a very low-flying, close-operating enemy aircraft. This is a 25mm self-propelled air defense gun. These are typically designed to deal with helicopters. So they have a high rate of fire. Helicopters are going to be very close to the ground, and they're going to pop up behind towns and forests and hills, fire off a rocket, and then dip down again. And so these vehicles with radars are designed to detect those helicopter targets out at 5 to 10 kilometers and shoot at them. This is a Type 07 35mm self-propelled gun. It's again a Soviet design of a Shilka, approximately a Shilka design, and a Gepard, which is the German design. This is a Type 88 37mm self-propelled air defense gun, again a copy of a Soviet design. This is the Type 80 57mm self-propelled gun. Here you can see they're using a tank chassis. So this is the type of system used in a high-threat environment where you've got lots of anti-tank rounds or you have other enemy tanks. And so this provides immediate support against low-flying aircraft and helicopters. This is the SK-331 point air defense system. And this one actually has a radar and it fires rockets. This is a copy of the Soviet SA-15 or Russian Tor-1 system. This is the HQ-60 self-propelled surface-to-air missile, of which China's got around 30. So it's a truck. You typically deploy this at a bridge or a headquarters or an important location like a fuel facility that you want protected against low-flying aircraft and helicopters. This is the HQ-7A self-propelled surface-to-air missile. It's a copy of the French Crotal system. So you could use this, again, to defend against a local target like a bridge or an airfield or an economic target. This is the HQ-9, which is a copy of the Russian S-300. This is a long-range anti-air missile. It's meant as a full-spectrum defense against high-flying, long-range aircraft. And so it's not the best system China has, but it's near the top. Here you can see a variety of Chinese systems. The HQ system on the top is a copy of the Russian SA-2. You've got the HQ-9, which is the copy of the Russian S-300. You saw the launcher for that in a previous slide. You've got the 5E-55R, which is the copy of the Soviet SA-10. Again, this is 1960s technology, the SA-10. And you've got the 48N6E Soviet SA-20. And at the bottom, you've got the HQ-12 Chinese rockets. These are expensive rockets used to shoot down airplanes. In theory, you'd want to fire 2 or 3 to knock down an aircraft. But experience from the Vietnam War, where the North Vietnamese were firing rockets at the American Air Force, and of Egyptian missiles being fired against the Israelis in 1973, indicates you're going to have to fire tens, if not dozens, to shoot down a single aircraft. And the reason is aircraft know that the system is there. They don't approach that closely. And so you're firing these rockets at the extreme outer range of these rockets where they have a very low probability of making a hit. But they are useful at keeping aircraft away until you run out of the rockets. So this is the Z-9 light helicopter, of which China's got some. This is the WZ-10 attack helicopter. China has more than 16. This is a number from about 5 years ago. But compared to the 1,000 plus that both the Russians and the Americans have, China's military is under-helicoptered. Helicopters are very useful because being able to fly low, it's difficult to detect them by radar because it's difficult to distinguish a helicopter from the backscatter of the trees and the houses nearby. And so it's a very useful platform for jumping up very high in the sky, firing off a rocket very quickly and then dropping back down again. Plus they're fast, which means you can deploy them around the battlefield carrying heavy anti-tank ordnance or anti-personnel ordnance. This is the WZ-19 light attack helicopter. So this is meant to bring firepower against a target, but more quickly than the previous WZ-10, which is a much heavier attack helicopter. This is the Blue Sword LJ-7 helicopter anti-tank guided missile, which reach out to about 2 kilometers range. This is a copy of the Hellfire missile used by the American Apache helicopter. China traded with the U.S. in the 1980s and got a couple of Black Hawk transport helicopters. And China's got 18 of those, and they've got copies of it as well as 600 other types of transport helicopters, a wide variety. Drones. This is the BZK-006 unmanned aerial vehicle. These provide surveillance. They allow you to see what's going on the battlefield. They can also do laser designation. Some of them can carry ordnance and hit targets. This is the ASN-105 UAV. This is the ASN-206 UAV. This is the WZ-5 UAV. This one here looks like a drone where when you're penetrating enemy airspace, you would fire this off independently and it creates a signature that would attract surface-to-air missiles. So it looks like another aircraft and then distracts the defense. This is the BZ-005 UAV, which looks suspiciously like an American UAV. This is the Sword Dragon Stealth UAV, which was detected in 2013. So it's basically a drone that flies very high at night and it's not detectable by radar. So it's less likely to be intercepted. This is the Chengdu Stealth UAV, which looks like a little flying wing. This is the Dark Sword Stealth UAV, a concept going back to 2006. It's basically just a hypersonic vehicle that would be flying on the edge of the atmosphere at enormous speeds. And this is the Shenlong space plane. Again, this is a concept. China is copying the American space plane concept, but it's not clear if they have one operational. So this is the L-15 trainer, which is basically a copy of the Soviet Delphin training vehicle. This is the J-7 Chengdu fighter ground attack. In other words, it operates as a fighter. It can chase other aircraft, but it can also drop ordnance on targets. It's got a range of around 850 kilometers, a combat radius, which means that's the range it can fly out to from an airfield and then fly back again. There's great variety of ranges within that, because if this aircraft has to fly low, which is typically what you want to do on a battlefield to avoid enemy radar, then it's going to have much less range than 850 kilometers. It could have half as much a range. China's got about 600 of these. This is the Xi'an JH-7 fighter ground attack, 1700 kilometer combat radius, of which is 192. This is an aircraft that's being phased out. This is the J-8 Shenyang Interceptor, 1,000 kilometers radius. China's got about 200 of these. These are aircraft that were not reduced in the 1980s. China had at one point the largest air force in the world, but they were basically aircraft that could only operate in good weather during the daytime because they had no radar. So against a modern air force, they were completely useless. They could never even approach a modern aircraft and conduct an interception. So those aircraft were removed and replaced with these intermediate aircraft, which are still would perform very poorly against a modern fifth generation air force like the US, but they're useful as an intermediary against other Chinese neighbors. This is the Q-5 Fantan ground attack aircraft, of which there's 500 total. These are thought to have been set up for nuclear weapons use. They have a range of around 600 kilometers radius. Again, this is an old design from the 1970s that was upgraded to the 1980s, and because it's got a nuclear role, they haven't gotten rid of it, but it's not a particularly advanced aircraft. This is a J-10 fighter. Looks like it's a copy of the Eurofighter. It's got a 550 kilometer range. China's got 224 of these. It is thought that it was built off of a LAVI design. When the US canceled Israel's LAVI aircraft program, it was thought that Israel retaliated by trading the technology to China. So there's a bit of a dispute in US-Israeli relations. This is a Sukhoi 27. China purchased 75 of these aircraft from the Russian Sukhoi company, 1,500 kilometer range. China then used this aircraft to build their own version of it, which caused an issue with their arms provider in Russia. The Russians traded the aircraft because they needed the revenue to sustain their production run. But the consequence is now China owns more of the Sukhoi 27 and this type of design than Russia does today. The Russian engine design is superior to the Chinese, and the Chinese have not yet been able to master the high temperatures material design necessary to keep the engine from getting replaced all the time. So the Russians still have a slight technical advantage in this particular aircraft frame. This is the J-11. It's the Chinese copy of the Russian Sukhoi 27. So it's basically a Sukhoi 27 reverse engineered by Chinese, and then the Chinese built their own version without giving Russia a license payoff. The Chinese have 169 total. They have a 1,500 kilometer range. The engines on the J-11 are worse than the Russian Sukhoi 27. This is the Sukhoi 30, a more advanced version. It's basically the same airframe as the Sukhoi 27, but with advanced control features, and it's got the ability to carry more advanced ordnance. And Russia sold 100 of these to China. This is the J-16, which is the Chinese copy of the Russian Sukhoi 30. Again, with a weaker engine, and again, it didn't make the Russians very happy when they saw this. So the Chinese trade with the Russians, who are in a bit of a bind because of reduced revenue. They're desperate to sell these aircraft to get the cash to keep their production runs up for their own air force. This is the Chengdu J-20 stealth aircraft with a fighter ground attack. So it's the Chinese response to the J-35. This is the J-31 stealth fighter ground attack aircraft. The Chinese have said that they have it available for export. There's more than 3 prototypes now. These are now in full production run. And so they're probably going to cap out at somewhat over 100 aircraft. And they're meant to offset the American F-22 and the J-35s, which are the F-35s, which are stealth aircraft. This is the J-18 stealth concept aircraft, but it's thought to have been either a concept aircraft or fake. So here you can see the similarity between the J-31 and the J-20 to the F-22 and the J-35. So there's certainly there's espionage going on here in technology, but in general there's only so many ways to build a stealth aircraft, and that technology has been well known since the 1990s. The Americans were operating stealth aircraft in the 1980s. So here's a way to interpret the generations of aircraft. What's important to note is that China today is about generation 4, with a few aircraft, the stealth aircraft they have in generation 5, and some of the older aircraft that I showed you before are actually a generation 3. So it's pretty bad. The Americans are at generation 5, which is that they have a preponderance of F-35s and F-22s, plus they have generation 4, which are basically upgunned F-15s. This is the Shenyang H-6 bomber, which is the primary bomber of the Chinese Air Force. And it also has a maritime role where it fires long-range missiles against ships. It's a copy of the Soviet Tupolev 16 Badger from the 1950s. China's got 112 of these, which is not a lot. They have 1,800 kilometers combat radius. Here you can see a row of H-6 bombers. This is the H-6U tanker aircraft, of which China's got 10, and this allows the Chinese aircraft to fly additional kilometers distance, depending on how often they refuel the aircraft. This is a very important aircraft, and possibly the most expensive type of aircraft in the Chinese inventory. It's the KJ-2000 AWACS, Airborne Warning and Control System. It's an airborne early warning aircraft, of which China's got 5. What these do is they operate that radome on top. It's a radar. And by flying very, very high, it's able to give awareness to the Air Force command staff on what the air situation looks like, where the enemy aircraft are, and it's able to guide in interception. It's much more efficient than a ground-based radar, which is a known location and can be destroyed by a missile. But these are very vulnerable aircraft, and they're high-value targets. And basically, in any air war, these will be the #1 targets to be destroyed because they have a huge multiplier impact on being able to control aircraft. So this particular airborne early warning aircraft can track 60 targets simultaneously, including low-flying targets, out to 470 kilometers range, and it can detect high-flying aircraft up to 600 kilometer range. Here you can see the KJ-2000s based at the Wuxi Air Force Base in Zhejiang province, which is a coastal province in China. This is the KJ-200 AWACS Airborne Warning and Control System, which China's got 4. So you've got a different kind of radar transmitter on the top of the aircraft. This is the ZDK-03 AWACS, which was sort of an emergency Chinese deployment to Pakistan, which didn't have the AWACS available to counter India's acquisition of the Israeli Falcon system. So China, to support its ally, quickly manufactured and exported these aircraft to Pakistan. This is the JF-17 Interceptor, which was exported by China to Pakistan. So it's a sort of a low-cost aircraft. It's got an airframe that you see here that's similar in the front to an F-18 and similar to an F-16 in the back. And it's meant as a cheaper alternative for a third and fourth generation aircraft for Pakistan. So China does not operate this aircraft. It manufactures it for its ally in Pakistan. This is the Tupolev 154 MD electronic intelligence aircraft, of which China's got 4 total. These are designed to collect radar information, determine what kind of radar it is, because radars have many, many complicated characteristics, because they have solutions in design to solve some of the physics problems that happen when you're emitting electromagnetic waves. And so you can fly an aircraft out and passively listen to the signatures of different radars, and then by reverse engineering the signals, you can figure out what kind of radar it is, and then you can tailor design the type of rocket to destroy the target based upon the type of signature. So it's a whole complicated world, but just know that the electronic medium is more important today than the kinetic medium. In other words, the radars are more important than the explosives, because the radars are the devices that allow you to see. So this aircraft is super important because it collects targeting information, like, for example, the different kinds of radars in Taiwan. This is the Ilyushin 76 heavy transport aircraft. Very important. These can carry vehicles, light vehicles. They also have parachutists that can jump out the back. These are Russian design, of course. China's got 10 of these. This is the Y-20 Kunpeng Xi'an heavy transport. It can carry 66 tons over 4,600 kilometers. There are 2 built in 2013 and many more since then. This shows you where the espionage came from. It's a combination of a C-17 Globemaster, an Airbus A400M, and the Ilyushin system. So here you can see a comparison. China's got a few of the Kunpeng Xi'ans. The Russians have about 100 Ilyushin 76s. The Americans have 250 Globemasters, and there's just 6 Airbuses. And you can see their comparative ability at lifting, and they are of comparable range. This is the WS-10J11 engine I mentioned earlier, the less reliable Chinese version of the Russian engine on the Sukhoi 27. And these are problematic because the high pressure and temperature tends to melt the parts of the engine. And so you want an engine that lasts longer, not shorter. Otherwise, you're spending a lot of time doing maintenance on aircraft. I mean, for every hour that an aircraft is flying, several hours are spent maintaining it. And so it's not enough to have a pilot. You have to have a lot of ground crew to constantly maintain aircraft. And if aircraft are not maintained, they actually fall apart while flying. They malfunction, flaps don't work, the fuel leaks, the gun jams, the radar turns off, and the aircraft become effectively useless. So the People's Liberation Army Navy. Here you can see basically a distribution of different kinds of submarines, surface ships, landing craft, and amphibious craft. So we start with the CJ-10 Donghai Coastal Anti-Ship Cruise Missile with a range of 1,600 kilometers and a speed of Mach 2.5, 2.5 times the speed of sound. This is a very standard weapon going back to the 1950s. Instead of having ships operating offshore, you could have these cruise missiles that will fire rockets against incoming ship targets. The problem is you need to have a radar to be able to see the ships out to shore. And so this is a good standard way of protecting your shores on the cheap without having to spend a whole lot of money. And these are mobile systems, so you can move them from one place to another. This is the CJ-10 ASCM system again, but it's on a TEL. a transporter erector launcher. So it's the same system, but you have these trucks that could relocate quickly on the coast and provide interdiction against enemy ships. Here you can see a launch of a CJ-10. Again, 1,600 kilometers range, and that's a pretty big rocket. It may or may not be vulnerable to getting shot down, but it does make an enemy fleet think twice before it approaches too closely to a shore. So we get into surface ships. This is the Hainan anti-submarine warfare ship. Basically very old technology. It's very unlikely they're going to be able to detect a large modern nuclear powered or diesel electric submarine. So it's used secondarily as a patrol vessel. China's got 50 of these. This is the Haicheng anti-submarine warfare ship. Again, not very useful in modern technology, but China's not seen a reason to get rid of them yet. There's 22 of these types. This is the Wochin mine countermeasures ship. It's a minesweeper. This is very important because China is a trading state. It depends heavily on imported fuel, and a few mines would be able to shut down its harbors. And so it needs these vessels to get rid of the variety of dangerous anti-ship mines that would interfere with Chinese commerce. This is the Wolai mine layer, of which China has one, because China, of course, wants to maintain commercial lanes for its own exports. But in the event of war, it might be useful to lay a pattern of floating mines out at sea. For example, if it wanted to disrupt commerce to and from Taiwan or Japan or some other state. This is the Huangfan fast attack craft, armed with 4 HY-2 anti-ship missiles. These missiles have a range of around 140 kilometers, which is a very big range, and China's got 11 of these. These little aircraft ships are very useful for keeping large fleets away from your coast, but they're not seaworthy. In other words, they can't go to sea for a very long time. In a storm, they would be knocked about. The radars on these ships are quite weak. Their air defense is very weak, and so you really can't operate them except on a shore. This is the Hujian fast attack craft. It's armed with 6 YJ-8 anti-ship missiles with a range of 45 kilometers. China's got a total of 6 of these. This is the Hushin fast attack craft. They're armed with 4 YJ-1 anti-ship missiles, a range of 45 kilometers, and they've got 20 total of these. This is the new Hubei fast attack craft. It's got a catamaran design. As you can see, 2 separate floating hulls on the left and the right. They're armed with 8 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles with a range of 270 kilometers. China's got 76 total of these. So, again, the same problem. They're not very seaworthy. They don't have a lot of range. Their air defense is relatively weak. Their radars are not very strong, but they're a good nuisance factor. So they're very efficient at policing the coast if you're dealing with a light threat or you're just dealing with an enemy merchant threat. And they would fire these rockets off and then have to turn around and get back to port and replenish because they don't carry extra missiles on their small bodies. This is the Jiandao corvette. So it's bigger than those patrol vessels, but smaller than a frigate. It's armed with 4 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles with a range of 270 kilometers range, and the first model was commissioned in 2012. So the Navy operates a number of Z-8 airborne early warning aircraft. These are aircraft that have a radar. You can see the radar off in the back, just behind the rear wheels, and this allows a helicopter to operate off the coast with a radar and then to look at enemy ships. And this supplements ground-based radars. Or if these radars were destroyed, this is an efficient way of putting up a radar quickly. This is a Y-8J naval AWACS, Airborne Warning and Control System, which China's got 4. The radar, in this case, is in the front nose. And it's useful for detecting ships and coordinating attacks. You might have very, very long range missiles, but if you can't see where the target is, then you're not going to be firing accurately. This is the Y-8W Naval AWACS Airborne Warning and Control System, which China's got 2, and here the radar is in the center back. This is the Y-9 Maritime Surveillance Aircraft and Anti-Submarine Warfare Platform. You can see the long tail at the back. This is a MAD, a magnetic anomaly detector, and this is a prototype version. The magnetic anomaly detector basically is a magnet that detects metal immediately underneath the aircraft, and you can reach out 1 to 200 meters, which is impressive because normally water suppresses the electromagnetic spectrum. So this will fly along. If it goes over a submarine, it will then begin procedures to drop depth charges. This is a design that's very standard. They almost all look the same. The British have the Nimrod. Canada's got the Aurora. All of these aircraft have the same basic configuration. And there's no need for speed because you want these aircraft to fly very far and very long. And so you have propeller aircraft because it allows them to loiter longer and use less fuel. This is a ground effects vehicle, which is a copy of a vehicle in the Soviet Union. It's sort of like a boat plane, but the wings are quite small. What they noticed was if you have a aircraft with small wings and you fly it just off the surface of the ground at very high speed, you're able to achieve enormous distances at great fuel economy. So you're using only a fraction of the fuel of an aircraft, but you're flying at the speed of an aircraft. And so these are useful for doing patrols along coasts and to have duties against submarines. Here's a V-22 Osprey clone. We see a partial picture of it. So the Chinese built basically a helicopter airplane. I don't have a picture of the American Osprey, but if you were to Google it, you'd see that the Chinese are basically copying American and Russian and European designs and experimenting to see if it fits their requirements. This is the Ka-31 Airborne Early Warning Helicopter. The Chinese purchased 2 from Russia. This is a standard aircraft from the 1980s. So you'd have one of these at the back of a Soviet or Russian ship, and it would take off. You can see the radar here would open up, and it's a cheap, efficient way of getting some visual view of what's going on the local sea space. Here's a Ka-28 anti-submarine warfare helicopter. So this helicopter chases submarines, and because they're so small, you can put more than one on the deck of a medium-sized ship. This is the 324 millimeter torpedo used by the People's Liberation Army Navy, and it's a copy of the U.S. Mark 46 or Mark 50 torpedo. So the Chinese have basically copied a pretty much standard design in the NATO fleets. So you can see the logic of air defense systems. The Chinese have 3 different ranges for the 3 different types of systems. You've got the HQ-7, which is a shorter range system. It goes out to 10 nautical miles, which is basically 15 to 18 kilometers. And it deals with the last moments in which a large missile is coming in on the ship. You've then got the HQ-9, which reaches out to 50 nautical miles. And some of the ships that, to protect themselves, will have the system. And it's got a much longer range. So if an aircraft is coming against your ship, you can hit the aircraft quite far out, and it forces the aircraft to deploy its ordnance at 50 nautical miles out, like 75, 80, 90 kilometers out. And then you've got the HQ-9, which is a much heavier extended range system, and this is typically used when a ship is responsible for protecting other ships, like a convoy of merchant vessels, or it's trying to protect amphibious ships, or it's trying to protect an aircraft carrier. So some ships have dedicated systems, powerful radars, a large battery of anti-air missiles, and their mission is to protect against aircraft. So here's the Jiangkai guided missile frigate. Standard NATO code is FFG. It's armed with a YJ-83 anti-ship missile, range of 270 kilometers. China's got 11 of these. So frigates are smaller ships. They're used for escorts. They chase submarines. They provide local air defense. They're not the heavy hitters of a navy. They don't carry a huge battery of anti-ship missiles, and they're not optimized for sinking ships. This is the Jiangwei FFG guided missile frigate. It's armed with 8 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles as the previous ship. There are 14 of this model. This is the Jianghu guided missile frigate, armed with 6 SY-1A anti-ship missiles with a range of 50 kilometers, of which there are 27 total. So it doesn't have a great deal of range. This is the Luda frigate, guided missile frigate, armed with 6 HY-2 anti-ship missiles, 140 kilometers range, of which there's 13 total. This is the Luhai guided missile destroyer armed with the YJ-82 anti-ship missile, 130 kilometers range, there's 1 total. This is the Luhu guided missile destroyer. Now, destroyers are larger than frigates, typically up to twice as large in terms of thousands of tons. This is armed with the 16 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles with a range of 270 kilometers. So that's a lot of missiles, 16. This is the Luoyang guided missile destroyer. It's armed with 16 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles, 270 kilometers range, of which there's 2 total. This is the Luoyang guided missile destroyer armed with 8 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles, 270 kilometers range, of which there's 2. This is the Luzhou DDG guided missile destroyer armed with 8 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles, 270 kilometers range, of which there's 2 total. This is the Lanzhou guided missile destroyer armed with 8 YJ-82 anti-ship missiles with a 500 kilometer range. So it's a very long range missile. It does need some system, either other ships or aircraft or radars to detect the targets because it's such range. There's 5 of these at the moment, but they're being upgraded. And you can see the different systems in this graphic. So these are the anti-ship missiles in service with the People's Liberation Army. The SY-1A CSS-N1 Skrubush anti-ship missile. It's a copy of the Soviet Styx rocket from the 1950s. It's got a 50 kilometers range and flies at Mach 1. This is the HY-2 CSSC-3D Seersucker anti-ship missile with 104 kilometers range. This looks like it's being deployed in Iran, one of the Chinese customers. This is the YJ-8 CSS-N4 Sardine anti-ship cruise missile with a 45 kilometers range. This is the YJ-62 or C-602 anti-ship cruise missile with 400 kilometers range, being launched from a tractor erector launcher, a TEL. This is the YJ-82 or C-802A Cicade anti-ship cruise missile. This is a copy by China of the American Harpoon missile, which is the most common anti-ship missile in the world, typically equipping the US, the Europeans, and all of their allies. This is the YJ-83 C-803 CSS-N8 Chicade anti-ship missile. It's got 270 kilometers range, and it's a Mach 2 rocket. In other words, it flies very quickly. It's not a cruise missile. It's an actual rocket, and flying at twice the speed of sound. This is actually a system purchased from Russia. It's the AS-17 Krypton KH-31A anti-ship missile. It's got 55 kilometers range, and it flies at Mach 3. The Russians are very good at high-speed rocket designs. This is the P-270 Moskit SSN-22 Sunburn anti-ship missile. Again, China purchased this type of rocket when it purchased 4 former Soviet Sovremeny destroyers. These have a range of 130 kilometers, and they fly at 3 times the speed of sound. This is the 3M-82 Moskit Russian Sunburn model variant. Again, an imported Russian missile with a 240 kilometers range. This is the 3M54 Club SSN-27 anti-ship missile. This is specifically for the Russian Kilo class diesel submarine that was sold to China. These have a range of 300 kilometers, and they fly at Mach 2.5. Obviously, the submarine has to have some idea of where the target is before it fires the rocket. So it'll typically get intelligence, or it'll fire a salvo of these rockets at a convoy, hoping some of them will then pick up the target when they arrive and hit. This is the Fuching, of which there's 2 types out of 200 logistics ships that support the Chinese fleet. Something the US does very well, which it began doing in World War II when it was fighting Japan in the Pacific, was that it had a huge floating logistics system of ships that would bring supplies from the US. It would meet up with the US fleet in the Pacific at atolls, which are small island groups and would resupply the U.S. fleet. So the U.S. fleet never had to go back to base. It was constantly at sea, unless it was damaged. Then it would have to go into port for repairs. So the Chinese are learning to do the same thing. It takes a lot of logistics ships in order to sustain a fleet by providing the missiles, especially the fuel for ships that don't have nuclear engines. Here you can see at-sea replenishment. Here you can see a fuel pipe moving across, allowing a tanker to refuel a ship. And this is an activity that takes up a lot of time at sea. It's very important. It can't be neglected. It can't be done in severely adverse weather. And it needs to be done quickly because these logistics ships are not well protected and they're quite slow. In the Falklands War, one such ship, the Atlantic Conveyor, was sunk by an Argentinian Exocet and a huge number of supplies were lost. So it is a dangerous activity doing at-sea replenishment. So these are the principal surface warships, which are the most powerful ships in the Chinese fleet. Here you've got the Hangzhou guided missile destroyer, which are actually two Sovremeni class destroyers purchased from Russia, and they're armed with 8 Musket anti-ship missiles. These are advanced ships with advanced damage control radars and control systems, albeit from the 1980s and 1990s, that the Chinese have copied from in order to build their current fleet. Now this is the aircraft carrier, the CV-16 Liaoning. China now has a second and a third carrier that are either deployed or on the verge of deployment. This is the 1998 Soviet Varyag aircraft carrier. The Chinese are still working on the J-15 Flying Shark, which is a navalized Russian Sukhoi 27. Here you can see it first landing on the aircraft carrier in 2017. The main issue is that it doesn't have the engine power to carry the payload it needs in order to be an effective anti-ship missile platform, so it's a work in progress. This is the follow-on plan that the CB had for the next aircraft carrier, which is currently deployed. Here you can see concept of the aircraft carrier with the J-15 Flying Sharks operating on the deck, as well as an airborne early warning aircraft on the deck, which is still concept. Here you can see the airborne early warning concept aircraft in 2003, and it's not yet operational. The Americans have these E-2Cs that operate off of their aircraft carrier decks that give them a lot of ability to see out. Here you can see the carrier group around the CV-16 Liaoning aircraft carrier. This aircraft carrier needs air protection. It needs protection against submarines. And so it's got a variety of different ships with different designs and different missions, all facilitating the aircraft carrier's main mission, which is using aircraft to detect enemy flotillas and to send out aircraft with payloads to destroy those flotillas. Here you can see the PLA aircraft carrier located next to a pier in 2013. Amphibious warfare, of which China's got a particular interest. They were planning their navy with a view to retaking Taiwan, with a view to threatening the Japanese Ryukyu Islands like Okinawa, and to be able to intervene in the South China Sea, particularly in the littoral areas like the islands off the coast of Vietnam, and possibly to have an impact on targets like the Philippines and Indonesia, Natuna Island. So here we have the PLZ 122mm self-propelled howitzer that is able to operate off of these landing craft ships. This is the Type 071 Yuzhou landing platform dock, of which China's got one at the moment. This shows the back dock access on the Type 071, which shows you where the vehicles and the various floating craft would come out of. This is the back deck access of the Type 071 Yuzhou LPD, showing the amphibious vehicles before the area is flooded. Here you can see a denser pack of armored personnel carriers and self-propelled guns prior to an amphibious landing. And in the back you can see a hovercraft. This is the Type 726 LCAC landing craft air cushion. These aircraft are useful because they can land on a beach and they won't set off the mines because there's very low pressure per square inch exerted by these aircraft. This here again is the Type 071 LPD and its LCAC operating next door. And these aircraft, these hovercraft are also quite fast. These were manufactured in the Ukraine and sold to China. Here you can see the Zuber LCAC made in the Ukraine. A very large version of the previous vehicle, and this one basically offloads tanks. Here you can see the Zuber LCAC being maneuvered into position. This is a concept for a 20,000 ton LHD, which has since been manufactured. So this is the Yukon landing ship tank, of which China's got 7, because tanks require heavier landing craft, and landing craft have to come right up to the beach, and the tank has to be able to drive out of an opening in the forward area of the vehicle, of the landing ship tank. Here you can see the Yuhai landing ship tank, of which there's 10 total. Here's the Yuting landing ship tank, of which there's 19. Here you can see the Yuting LST, and here the vehicles are coming off of the rear, and you've got a landing pad for helicopters as well. Here's the Yudang landing ship medium, of which there's 1 total. Here's the Yubei landing ship medium, of which there's 10. This is the smallest design, the Yunnan landing craft utility. So it's essentially meant to land non-vehicles or non-heavy vehicles and infantry. And China's got 120 total of these. Here are Yunnan LCUs landing on a beach in China. So this is typical of what you would expect if China were to operate against Taiwan. Submarines. This is the Ming diesel submarine, SSK, of which there are 20. Diesel submarines tend to be quieter than nuclear submarines, but they need to refuel. This is the Song SSK diesel submarine. It's armed with 2 YJ-8 CSS-N4 Sardine anti-ship missiles of a range of 45 kilometers, and there's 16 total of these. This is the UN SSK diesel submarine. It's armed with 4 Club SSN-27 Sizzler anti-ship missiles, which are a Russian design. They have a range of 300 kilometers, and there are 4 of those rockets per submarine. There's 4 submarines total. This is the Kilo SSK diesel submarine. It's a special Russian export submarine that's particularly quiet. It's armed with 2 Club SSN-27 Sizzler anti-ship missiles of a range of 300 kilometers. There's a total of 12 of these kilos, and they're very quiet when operating in shallow coastal waters, which typifies the real estate in the northern part of the South China Sea and the Chinese coast between China, Japan, and China, Taiwan. Here you can see a Kilo diesel-electric submarine being transported. This is a Gulf guided missile diesel propulsion submarine, which China uses and it's basically a test bed for launching vertical ballistic missiles. This is the Shang nuclear-powered submarine, which China's got 2 total. These submarines have basically unlimited range. I mean, the limit is the food that the crew bring. The submarine itself will operate for years at a high speed. This is the Han nuclear propulsion submarine, armed with 4 Donghai 10 anti-ship cruise missiles of a range of 1,620 kilometers. China's got a total of 3 Han submarines. So this is the 533mm Y6 submarine torpedo, and it's a copy of the US Mark 48 torpedo, which is a standard American torpedo that submarines use to hit other submarines. And so obviously this is a product of Chinese espionage. And this shows the great improvements in the silence of diesel submarines in the Chinese fleet over time. And it shows the different designs and how they progressively have gotten a lot more quiet. So here you can see the Gulf SSB test bed that's used to launch ballistic missiles. This is the Zia ballistic missile submarine. And the reason I'm showing it to you is that even though this course is about conventional weapons, Western strategy against the Soviet Union was to use conventional weapons at the breakout of the Third World War and destroy these nuclear platforms before they have a chance to use their ballistic missiles. So even though we're not going to study nuclear weapons in the course, there's nothing precluding studying conventional weapons destroying nuclear targets. So this submarine is no longer in service. It was thought there were two of them. One of them might have been damaged and the other one was taken out of service. This is the Jin ballistic missile submarine, of which there are currently 6 on patrol off the coast of China. They carry the main nuclear deterrent against the U.S. Here's a Jin submarine on a pier in what is very likely Hainan Island in the northern part of the South China Sea. Here's the JL-1 sea-launched ballistic missile and the JL-2, which are the main missiles carried by the Jin class. Here you can see a sea-launched ballistic missile carrier operating off of Hainan. And so this ship could meet up with the submarine and then load the ballistic missiles into the submarine if the submarine would have fired off its volley. This is the Yuan Wang satellite tracking ship, of which China's got 5, and it's used to monitor Chinese tests. It's used to monitor space and low-flying satellites, and it's used to surveil and learn the telemetry and ballistics of the missile tests of other countries. This is the Yuan Wang 4 satellite tracking ship after it got into an accident. So China has the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile tractor-elector launchers, and these fire rockets at U.S. aircraft carriers off the coast of China. So China decided to test these against the Yuan Wang satellite tracking ship that got into an accident. Here is the rocket itself, the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile. Effectively, this has compelled the Americans to no longer deploy their carriers off the coast of China. But it's not groundbreaking because the American Navy never intended on deploying its aircraft carriers off the coast of China because all coasts are lethal to aircraft carriers going back a century. Here you can see a makeshift aircraft carrier target built in the wilderness, and China fired 2 DF-21Ds against that aircraft carrier. And it was successful. Of course, the target in the desert was not moving. So in 2011, the Yuan Wang, which was moving, was hit by a DF-21D, which basically was proof of concept that those missiles with satellite guidance can hit a moving target like a U.S. aircraft carrier. And this is the range that this missile has. And you can see the maximum range goes way out past Japan, past the U.S. base in Okinawa, and reaches out to the U.S. base on Guam. These are missiles operated by the Second Artillery Ballistic Missile Organization, which is the organization that operates the nuclear missiles in China. But they also operate a large number of conventional rockets that are targeted against Taiwan, because China does not have a lot of confidence that its Air Force will get through Taiwan, so it would fire volleys of non-nuclear missiles against, particularly against Taiwanese air bases to destroy the Taiwanese Air Force. So you can see here the DF-1, the DF-2, DF-3, DF-4, and DF-5 ballistic missiles. These are some of the bases where these missiles are deployed. Most of these bases operate long-range nuclear ballistic missiles aimed at Russia and the United States. But many of them on the coast operate the non-nuclear missiles that are basically targeting Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and U.S. bases. So here we've got the DF2 Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile, NATO code CSS-1. It's a very old missile. This is the DF3 IRBM. It's a liquid-fueled rocket, so it takes about 45 minutes to fuel up. This is the missile that was exported to Saudi Arabia that caused so much consternation in the 1980s. And the Saudis still operate the base in the desert south of Riyadh. This is the DF4, again a liquid-fueled rocket. It's got a 3 megaton warhead. It's MIRVed, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, so it's got 3 separate warheads. It's at a fixed site, which means it's very easily destroyed if it doesn't launch first. And it's thought its main target is Moscow and Guam. This is the DF5 ICBM, 12,000 kilometers range. This was built in the 1970s and was deployed in 1981-82 against the U.S. If you can imagine that, when China was an ally of the U.S. near the end of the Cold War, it was still building nuclear missiles targeting the U.S. It has 4 to 5 megaton detonation yield per warhead. Carries 6 warheads. It's MIRV, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicle. Again, because it's liquid fueled, it takes a while to load up. And if the Americans see that it's being fueled up by satellite, they can put a nuclear weapon on the location in 45 minutes from the other side of the planet. It's got a circular error probability of 1,000 meters, which means it's good enough to blow up a city, but it's not going to hit any hardened targets. There's about 20 of them, and it's since been surpassed in the 1990s. This is the DF-31 mobile ICBM, NATO CSS-9, of which China's got 12. This is a solid fuel rocket. You press a button and it launches immediately. It has the range to reach the US. And it's on a mobile vehicle because the Chinese realize that American missiles are very accurate and very fast, and any silos in the ground would be easily destroyed. And so the Chinese, in a crisis, in theory, would disperse this system across their countryside. So here you can see the DF-31, 11,000 kilometers range, and you can see a warhead. Well, it's more of a bus, which contains the warheads being deployed to the rocket. Here you can see the DF-31A, which is a version of it, CSS-9 Mod 2, of which there are 24 being deployed on their transporters, erector launchers. Here's the DF-31 second stage, undergoing diagnostics. Now here's a DF-16 intermediate range ballistic missile. It's still a very large rocket, but it's actually not intended to fly all the way to another continent. This one is regional, so this would hit Japan or Taiwan or the Philippines. Here's a DF-16. It was identified in 2012 with its tractor erector launcher, and this has both a nuclear and a non-nuclear role, so it's very likely to be used against, say, Taiwan. Here's a DF-21 MRBM, medium range ballistic missile. This is shorter range than an intermediate range ballistic missile. So these are definitely just to hit neighboring states near China. Here's a DF-21 solid fuel mobile rocket system. It's got warheads that are each 500 kilotons. It also has a role as an anti-ship ballistic missile. It can be used as an ASAC to shoot down satellites. It's MIRVed, so it has 6 warheads in the bus, and it's got 2,100 kilometers range. Here's a DF-11 short-range ballistic missile. This is an M9. It's a conventional system used to target airfields and enemy fuel concentrations and targets of interest. Here's a DF-11. China's got 108 launchers and 600 missiles, and it would be these systems that would be bombarding Taiwan. Here's a DF-11A brigade of 24 launchers deployed at their facility. Here's a scramble drill involving the DF-11A. Here's a DF-15. These are solid fuel rockets. Again, they're conventional. There's 108 launchers with 350 missiles, 600 kilometers range. There is a warhead that has a nuclear variant, but these are in all likelihood going to be used in a bombardment role against Taiwan. Here's a DF-15 launching. Here's the DF-15 brigade at their indoor facility. So here you can see the ranges of the different rockets. Obviously the DF-5 is an intercontinental ballistic missile, 13,000 kilometers range, meant to go from China all the way to the US. And those missiles are deployed in caves, but mostly just on base. There are no silos for the DFI, but there are silos being built at the time of this lecture in China, and the purpose is not entirely clear, because you would have thought the mobile system was a more reliable way of dispersing an asset that could be destroyed by a U.S. nuclear strike. Here's the FJ-1 anti-ballistic missile, which is basically a Chinese concept going back to the 1970s. So here you have a rocket with a nuclear warhead that would fly up into the sky, detonate, and blow up incoming missiles. Very difficult to get it to work because when the first nuclear bomb goes off, all the radars will have static and won't be able to detect anything in the atmosphere. Here are the Chinese launch and space control sites. Much of this is civilian and scientific, but most of it is intended for military purposes, either to launch rockets at foreign targets or to launch rockets into space to interfere with enemy satellites or to launch your own satellites. So here you can see the number of satellites being launched by China up until 2014, and it just shows a very heavy pace of launching. It was within this time that the country with the largest number of satellites, which used to be Russia, was replaced by China. So here's a breakdown of the different kinds of satellites, and some of these are classified, some of these are not classified. So you've got communication satellites, you've got the GPS, the 10 Beidou satellites, a whole variety of surveillance satellites, particularly maritime surveillance of aircraft carriers. You've got your signals intelligence at the bottom, which is important. It basically listens to radars and communications from the US and Japan and Russia and India. China conducted in 2007 and 2014 an anti-satellite test. They basically hit, without a nuclear warhead, it was a conventional strike. I mean, basically, there's no detonation. It was actually physical contact at high velocity to destroy the target. They destroyed a target moving at 7.42 kilometers a second. So you can imagine the difficult computing power to make that happen, and it was successful. So this exposes low orbit satellites. We still don't have the technology to destroy satellites that are deep in orbit, which is about 250,000 kilometers beyond Earth. So here we have the Shenzhou 9, which is a rocket docking with a Tiangong space lab. This has since fallen out of the sky, but it was an important concept, and the Chinese have since worked on redeploying a lab into space, and it gives training to astronauts, and it allows the Chinese to practice techniques that they would need to interfere with surveillance satellites in the event of war. So this is the concept of China Space Station, which is currently not on schedule, but it's basically a design to compete with the Russian European Space Agency and NASA project.